on a perfectly dreary evening, as the freaks and ghouls scamper afoot, dilapidated weaponry on the ready. Castlevania NES Hard. An unholy test of psychic endurance, nerve response, intestinal fortitude. Or maybe not. So this is a playthrough of Castlevania on the NES, but it's not really about that. It's really just an excuse to talk about a couple things I had in mind, mainly about 1cc's, the sort of 1cc mentality, perceived difficulty, NES hard, all that kind of stuff. Sort of how I look at 1cc and sort of beating games in general, my strategizing and the way I sort of break things down. And as kind of implied there, Castlevania on the NES, it wasn't really a hard 1cc at all. As a matter of fact, actually, I was speaking to my buddy Chris from the Hidden Fortress, and when I told him I was going to play Castlevania for fun, and maybe I'll go for a 1cc, he actually came back and said, I think you can do a no death. And after a day of playing, I got back to him and said, yeah, I think you're right. I don't do the no death run here. As a matter of fact, I haven't actually gotten it just yet, and it's actually not so much because of the game itself. It's more I've been contending with, it is the game itself, the hardware. It's been failing. I tried replacing a capacitor on the PCB, and yeah, that was kind of the nervousness I was having when I was getting later on into the game. It wasn't so much the game play, but whether or not my cartridge is going to die. So I got pretty close a few times, and it just glitched out on me. But it doesn't matter. Just doing this run, which I guess equates to a 1cc. So kind of the background of that, and something I'm doing fairly often is I'm overestimating, I think, a lot of these games and the perceived difficulty. Like a lot of people, I grew up on these games. This was really my entry into gaming as a child. At 9 years old, we got the NES on Christmas Day, like a lot of people. And, I was too young, I think, to really understand these games. And so my memory of them from that era is that they're just crushingly hard. Pretty much all of them, right? And over the years, I hadn't actually revisited too much NES. I'm just dabbling here and there. Maybe in very few cases, I played semi-seriously a couple games, like maybe Punch-Out. Actually, only really Mike Tyson. And it wasn't until last year that around this time actually, around Halloween, that I decided to just dive in again, go back to the NES, get a console, cartridges, real actual cartridges, and a CRT, and sort of try to, see if that experience was all it was cracked up to be. And right away, a few things struck me, is that whole experience really did make a difference. It was different for me anyways from emulation and the experience I was getting from that. And it was shocking to me how different it was. So I was shocked when I played on the CRT and I realized I'd forgotten how all these games looked. And later on I learned I'd also forgotten how they played. And in my memory, not only were they punishingly difficult, but also in the intervening time when I wasn't playing them all these decades, that was the mantra. People usually use that as the NES and these games as a contrast to the modern, the perceived sort of lack of challenge in modern console gaming. And I myself too kind of felt that way. I was sort of in all that time frame. Actually, I was basically going into the sort of arcade culture and the mindset that comes along with that. So if there were games where that applied on console, had sort of their arcade mentality of challenge and satisfying loop and difficulty curve, I would get into those games. But for me, I was basically becoming something like an arcade gamer, the attitude that goes along with that. And so, in my head, I had it in my head that, okay, these NES games, they're also really hard. They're kind of in the same vein as that arcade mentality. And of course, it makes sense because I also remember from that era, we'd go to the arcades and then we'd play these games and then we'd come home and we'd kind of look for that experience at home. It was natural to think that developers would try to do that and bring that to home consoles. And it kind of felt like that as a kid, But then again, looking back on it, I didn't have a lot of time and money to spend at arcades, so I didn't really get too in deep into it. And to me, all the games were just very hard. But anyways, about, like I said, last year, I kind of got back into this and I picked up a bunch of games that I was interested in. And pretty much almost in every instance, I was pretty surprised at how easy these games were to clear, to beat, to 1cc, or even no death. And sometimes I would even go online and I would see what other people would say, and they would still continue to echo that these games are brutally difficult. And, some people would mention that a game like Castlevania isn't that hard of a game, but then implicit in all that is they're kind of referring to all the continues you get more than anything. And when I was looking to play this, I kind of made the same mistake I've been making ahead of time before I get into the game, thinking, okay, this is going to be a real challenge because of all these thoughts I had and still have kind of occupying my space on these types of games beforehand. And then later on, not too far down the road of that, discovering that it's actually, in most cases, they're not nearly as difficult as I was thinking. And so I guess this is kind of a two-part thing that I'm talking about here. It's sort of how I guess I've honed my tolerance for challenge with arcade games. And, specifically shmups, especially, because a lot of the people who go for 1cc's in the sphere that I pay attention to the most, kind of it's recognized that those games are generally the most challenging of the arcade style games. Not always. I mean, there's others. There's beat 'em ups and many other arcade style games that have all sorts of challenge. Fighters are a little bit different. Those are also challenging, but usually that's because of the sort of infinite depth of challenge that you get from playing against other humans, which makes it more almost like a sport, right? But when it's just you against the game, most of those games that I find quite challenging are basically of the arcade tradition. And so, even as I say this, that these NES games aren't that hard, it kind of divides people right away into two different categories, I find. There's one set of people that right away, they're kind of on your side. They're like, this is all kind of not so hard. I've cleared a lot of games. I've beaten a lot of games, 1cc's, whatever. And then there's another side that almost has like this, I don't know what it is. It's kind of like they get upset, or they just, hey, bro, I'm going to game how I game, and don't, yuck my yum, or I don't, do people say that? I don't. I'm sort of upset that I even said that myself. But basically the idea is people don't want to hear it, and they think you're being elitist. And if they kind of knew where a lot of, I think where a lot of people come from with this 1cc arcade mindset that I'm talking about, they would think differently, because in my experience, a lot of players that get used to trying to go for these challenging clears, one of the reasons they get there is because they're never satisfied with their performance or skill level. They always think, I still kind of suck at this game. I got to keep playing. I got to keep improving. And it's that perseverance mentality. And, obviously there's going to be some people who are sort of elitist about it, and they just think they're great from birth, and they pretend that they didn't work at it and take a lot of time and struggle. Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. And I'm certainly not doing any of this or saying any of this to toot my own horn that I'm that great of a gamer. I actually think a lot of these skills are fairly easily had, and that there's really only a lack of perspective, I think, with a lot of gamers. They just don't see this perspective. They don't see the 1cc mindset in action. I also kind of want to talk about that a little bit. And this is no exception, even though this is a relatively easy clear. The reason why it's an easy clear for me was because I use these techniques that I'd sort of, I guess, consciously and unconsciously honed from from clearing, more substantial games. And I guess I would break it down kind of like this. So generally what I would do is I would, start a game up, and again, my assumption is this game's going to kick my ass. And maybe that's a healthy assumption because it makes sure that I'm on my toes and I'm paying attention. I think that's right off the bat the first thing. I think a lot of people, they don't really pay attention. They come home from a hard day of work. They've got other responsibilities, other things in their mind. And I get that. I've been there too, where it's hard to focus and play a game. And usually when I'm in that state, I actually don't bother. I just turn it off and I walk away. I don't really think gaming, for me anyways, is an opportunity to disengage. I take it a little bit differently. I think of it as an opportunity to grow and improve. I like that sense of improvement, that you're getting better, that you're learning a skill. And I do think those skills are transferable. probably talk about that some other time. A lot of people think that gaming is just this sort of, even if you find skill in it, it's so temporary and doesn't really impact the rest of your life. I think that's completely false. I have a whole bunch of reasons why. I'm not going to get into it right now. But yeah, essentially the first thing is paying attention to the game and sort of thinking your way through it. Or sometimes not even thinking your way through it, but just sort of brute forcing certain things that you normally wouldn't even think about. I know when I was a kid and I lacked the perspective, I didn't think about it. Simple things of like, hey, can I just run through this area? Can I take damage by running through enemies and then, find some health at the end of that and minimize my risk? Lots of little things like that. Turns out a lot of these games do have those sections or ways that you can manipulate the AI of the enemies. Sometimes I just spend a little bit of time doing things, seeing how the enemy responds, and then I sort of catalog that. My memory is not actually that great, and I think memory is a big part of just dealing with these games. Everybody will tell you, once you memorize things, the game starts becoming a lot easier. And I do think memory is a big component of it, and that's another reason why active gaming, paying attention, is important. And then maybe the next part of that, and sort of naturally flows from that, is identifying the sections and parts in a game that are the choke points. And I find that usually these games, pretty much in all cases, a big chunk of the game isn't actually all that difficult. It can be almost played down pat fairly quickly. But really the challenge often becomes like a few sections, maybe a part of a level, or maybe a boss battle or something. And then I guess what people are maybe doing or not doing is they're not looking at like, here's something I got to strategize. I got to find a strategy for this. And so if the average game has, like Castlevania here, I think maybe has 2 or 3 of those sections. I would say, and depending on how you loosen this up, I mean, you might also have like, A and B choke points to pay attention to. The A class are the stuff that can just end your run easily, and the B is like the stuff that, you can maybe get 90% of the time, but still there's something about it that's not 100% automatic. And so Castlevania has maybe like only 2 or 3 A sections that can end your run if you're, let's say going for no death in this case. And 2 of them I think are fairly obvious. One is the end of the castle hall that's going to be coming up here soon, right before the Reaper boss. And I guess the Reaper boss himself, I kind of include those together. And that section might even be considered the hardest of all in the game. And then the other one would probably be the bats at the end, the last level. As you're crossing the bridge, there's just a lot of opportunities to lose a lot of life or to get knocked into the pit. And then just after that, you have these hunchbacks, in the clock tower, where they can easily start swarming you and knocking you into the pit, just draining your life. And that's just before Dracula. So where my mind usually goes right off the bat when I see these choke points is I start to look around at what the game is giving me. Developers obviously made these sections, A, probably for a reason, but B, definitely they know it's there. They know that these are going to be the hardest parts. So usually the way any decent developer, and my assumption is all these developers, not only decent, but actually extremely skillful. That's why these games have such longevity. And, if you think you're so smart and you could have done this better, chances are you're wrong, and the developer actually did think through your supposed solutions to the problem in a game. The only difference is that they came up with a solution that requires you to think outside of your comfort zone. So sometimes, it's a certain weapon that you got to hold on to. Like in Castlevania, no secret, the holy water is something that's best held on to. Makes the boss battles, as you've been seeing, pretty much trivial. And the hidden depth in a lot of these old games, all sorts of little tricks that you can sort of build up over time. Like one thing I noticed was if you use your sub-weapon a lot in a row, it tends to give you a 2 times or 3 times drop next time you hit a candle. So I actually use that as part of my strategy that in some cases, definitely at the end where I fight Dracula, you'll see it, where I use it to make sure I get the double shot drop and then make the next part that much easier. So often, if you just look around at what the game is giving you right around that section, usually, like a sub-weapon or just something else, like you can play around with it, and usually you'll discover something. You can form your own strategy, you can even look online to what other people have to say, and there's almost always something that makes the section a lot easier, if not completely trivial. So related to this also is sort of a sub-strategy. So when shit goes wrong, because it just does, for those sections especially, you have to typically think of a plan B if your main strategy fails. So for example, in that Reaper section, I realized the trouble with that is you have to hold on to your holy water from basically the beginning of the stage. And although it's gotten to the point where it's almost a foregone conclusion that I can hold on to it through the whole stage, there is a chance I might end up without it. And then right before that hall in the Reaper, I really have no sub-weapon of importance other than the cross. So that itself doesn't make the hall that easy. As a matter of fact, by itself, it's not all that effective. And for the Reaper, it's probably the second best sub-weapon, but it makes that fight quite challenging. So my plan B was basically to, if I have to do that section again and with the cross, then I use that trick where I would spam it, once I really didn't figure out exactly what the terms were, but if you use it a lot on an enemy, it'll drop the double shot or the triple shot. In the case in the hall, right before the hall, I spam the skulls that spit fire or whatever, and maybe the skeletons after, the red skeletons that keep regenerating. And actually, that's kind of helpful if you need to do the spamming thing. And then the next candle I hit gets a double drop, and then I just basically stand in one spot, use my crosses to weaken the knight, and hopefully take care of the Medusas. And then once the knight is cleared, and I've used nothing but crosses, I get the triple shot drop, and then do that for the next knight. And then by the time I'm at the Reaper, hopefully I still have all my health. There's a chicken health in the wall just before the hall. And so if I get to the Reaper with all my health, I found that I could actually figure out how to beat him with the cross if need be. So basically stuff like that. It's contingency planning basically. And then I'd say another thing that I learned from playing arcade style games and 1CCing is probably the most important skill or technique is what's called routing. Which routing is kind of a bunch of things, I think, but on the surface, it sounds like just like, okay, what's my path? What path do I take? And that is a part of routing. But another part is basically your timing. Where do I end up? Routing is kind of everything. It's like not just your path you take, but where you are at different points in the game, your choices at each point. Do you pick up this weapon or do you not? Do you avoid these things over here? How do you manipulate the enemy? It's all basically falls under routing. And so memorization and routing are also kind of tightly interwoven. And so all this stuff kind of, I think to some people, especially just your average gamer, just sounds like a lot of overhead. Why would they bother? Why would it sounds like homework basically. And what I'm saying is I don't even know how I got there. I think I just got there just by doing over time, just playing those arcade games and picking up on these skills over time. And so I think the average gamer hasn't actually had this in their arsenal because of maybe they've never been exposed to it, or maybe they are making this sort of tacit assumption that there is two classes of gamers, those who can and those who can't. And, really I'm saying that it's not like that at all. I think the vast majority of people out there can get there if they just know some of the very basics. And anyways, this is like just surface level stuff. I'm not going in too deep with this. I definitely have a lot more to say about this, and I'm just sort of taking this opportunity with a sort of casual, clear talk about a few of those things. And, using the NES archetype of NES hard as sort of a contrast. If you take this sort of attitude that, these games are not only beatable, but they're made to be beaten. And what you think of as beating a game, that's another thing I don't really want to get too far into, but I was kind of surprised to see how a lot of people thought beating a game was just getting to the end. Doesn't matter how. I used save states. I used all the continues in the world, and I don't know what the answer is there. Doesn't sound like it's particularly meaningful if you can literally define it however you wish. But of course, people can say whatever they want to. But for me, again, this is a challenge for myself. I don't really care too much about how other people perceive it. But I guess if you take this attitude that beating a game is in a way, it's more like you're beating a part of yourself. It's really like, it's not you versus the game. It's you versus you. You versus your worst instincts, your desire to give up, to cave in, to, assume that you're not good enough, or, any number of things that your brain is probably constantly telling you. I know my brain is constantly telling me this, despite any of my efforts to the contrary. And so for me, beating a game, the way I guess define it typically is to set up some sort of appreciable challenge ahead of time. Of course, I can just if you're talking about arcade games, you can just literally just credit feed to the end and say, I beat the game. But relative to what I get out of it, or I want to get out of it, it's pretty meaningless. So I just took this attitude of setting up challenges, and then it's kind of natural. It flows naturally from that. How do I achieve those? How do I meet those challenges and achieve those goals? And yeah, I guess this whole idea of these NES games, which I do believe have not only challenge, but incredible amount of depth. They're some of my favorite games, and I've been having incredible amount of fun in the last year playing them. I really didn't anticipate it. But I just feel like there's a mismatch between how people perceive them and what I think is the reality if you just do this little perspective shift. And I guess I have a lot more to say about that. I don't want to go too much and pontificate on it too much, but I guess this was my opportunity to just sort of set that up and have a little bit of fun. So that was my little clear of Castlevania NES, and yeah, probably say a lot more about this in the future, and thanks for watching.